Chapter 15. High Rendezvous. The first American air raid on Tokyo had occurred more than 2 years before, and attacks against key Japanese strongholds had increased ever since. But it was not until my fighter training that the bombs hit Hiro. By now, the loss of such vital bases as Indonesia, Burma, and Sumatra had greatly reduced our fuel supply. Already, in fact, the shortage was severe enough to prohibit engaging the enemy in lengthy air battles, even with our best fighter planes. Radar stations on our main islands warned of enemy approach. If their course was from Nagoya to the east or Oita the opposite direction, we relaxed. If they headed for Osaka between the two, we took to the sky, fearing that they might veer toward Hiro. Already it was mainly a matter of preserving our aircraft in virtually any manner possible. It was just before noon one day in November that Hiro's air raid sirens shrieked for the first time in earnest. Rushing to our trainers, we scrambled in, thundered down the runway, and headed for the clouds. Upon our return, a short while later, the base was still intact. A flight of fighter-escorted B29’s had bypassed Hiro and assaulted nearby Kure. For several days afterward, the situation was repeated. Sirens keening, our scramble for the frantic takeoff and cautious return. Each time, Hiro remained unharmed. Before long, our training increased, and I graduated from my trainer to the Hayabusa 2, becoming a full-fledged fighter pilot, something I had dreamed about much of my life. Our furtive hide-and-seek tactics with the enemy, however, had disillusioned me terribly. Yasuo Kuwahara was not the invincible samurai of the skies, not the noble and glorious fighter pilot who would perform stunts over Tokyo on the Emperor's birthday or on National Foundation Day. Instead, I was compelled to flee at the first sign of danger, to hide like a coward. The situation filled us all with disgust and humiliation. Simultaneously, it was depressing and alarming to realize that our country was in such dire straits. True, we were assured by our leaders that our elusive tactics were only temporary, that Japan was prepared for continual enemy encroachments, that at the right moment it would counterattack with overwhelming savagery. But such propaganda had acquired the odour of decay for many of us. True, Kamikaze had taken its toll on our enemies, but it had not turned them back. One day we returned from the clouds to discover that the games of our recent past were over. Hiro was belching smoke, one of its hangars enveloped in flame. Several Liberator bombers had appeared with scant warning and assaulted us, tearing up part of the airstrip, destroying much of the fighter assembly plant. Firefighters were battling frantically while a repair crew hastily struggled to fill in craters along the runways. It was more than 2 hours before, fuel running low, we were able to make a precarious landing. Having given our reports in the orderly room, we wandered aimlessly about the base, surveying the destruction. A bitter and dejected group of young fighter pilots. Nakamura and I plodded slowly along the grey-white runway, hands in our pockets, heads down, except for an occasional glance about to assess the damage. So this was what bombs could do to a base, and it was only a small taste of things to come. We both knew that, and stared for a time at the charred hangar with its ruined aircraft. "Fighter pilots that can't fight," Nakamura sneered. "Ha!" Later that day I visited Tatsuno. He had made his solo flight in the Akatombo and was doing well thus far. With the bombs now striking Hiro, it was unlikely that he and his companions would undergo a full apprenticeship. "You might be flying the Hayabusa before you know it," I said. "Maybe any day now." For a while Tatsuno offered no reply. We were seated together on the tail section of a badly damaged bomber near one of the hangars, watching the repair work still underway along parts of the airfield. Eventually he turned and eyed me searchingly. "Maybe it will be the way we always hoped, Yasuo. It seems too good to be true, and yet—" He hesitated, frowning. I watched him, sensing that he was about to say something I didn't want to hear. "Well, I never expected things were going to be like this." "Like what?" I asked, feeling a bit angry for some reason. He shrugged. "I don't know, but if we're really going to win, When do we start? The attacks are getting worse all the time. And if we can't stop them now, how can we expect to stop them a month from now, or a half year from now? What's the secret? What are we waiting for? Tatsuno's voice was quiet and strained. Things usually get bad for both sides before a war is over, I said. Yes, but what are we doing? Are we really hurting the Americans? Are we bombing California, New York, and Washington? Those places are too far away right now, I countered. Of course, Tatsuno said, and we're too close. That's the whole problem. They're too far and we're too close. They're too big and we're too small. Do you realize that California alone, just one of their 48 states, is the size of our entire country? Oh, that can't be right, I mumbled. It is right, he insisted. Don't you remember our geography class? California is as big as our 4 main islands combined. Maybe, I admitted. But it's not just size that wins wars. It's the spirit. It's determination and courage. Tatsuno angled me a glance that seemed a bit scornful. So aren't they determined and courageous too? They've got to be to have us taking it on the chin like this. When are we going to strike back and make the Americans retreat? Once they've dumped their bombs on every city in Japan and taken over the Emperor's palace? I offered no answer. There was none. Eventually I arose. I'd better get back to the barracks, I said. Already? He looked rather sorrowful. You've only been here a few minutes. I know, I replied uncertainly, and began to walk away. But I've got a lot to do. I haven't finished studying for my test on navigation. Once I glanced back. Tatsuno was still sitting there, leaning forward on his knees, gazing out across the runway. I waved, but he barely lifted his hand. That afternoon I was in the air again, 5 of us flying above the inland sea at 12,000 feet somewhere between Kure and Iwakuni. Clouds were forming rapidly below us, literally before our eyes, and falling steadily behind like shredding cotton. Far off, beyond the mountains, a spectral moon hung faint and grey, and occasionally I glanced downward at the sea, its endless, undulating surface, wrinkled, patched with shadow and alternating expanses that dazzled the eye. At the moment it again seemed very strange to think that throughout the world men were caught up in a cataclysmic struggle of death and hatred. Slightly ahead and above me was Lieutenant Shimada, a veteran combat fighter whom we all greatly respected. Shimada had fought in many a battle going back to the early days when our planes had so badly outclassed the American P-39s and P-40s. He had known the taste of victory, and more than one enemy had fallen victim to his guns. Sunlight gleamed on his cockpit, revealing at times the man within. I could see his leather helmet, the goggles resting upon his forehead, and my heart brimmed with admiration. Slender and unassuming, he spoke very little, but he fought with great talent and valour. Occasionally Shimada's head tilted slightly from side to side as he surveyed the waiting sky. But even those motions, the very line of his shoulders, conveyed precision and vigilance. The vast reaches of the sky, the water and receding landscape and the waning moon all imparted serenity. I shifted in my seat, glancing back and downward over my left wing at the ocean. Winter would soon be upon us, and once more, gazing toward the distant shores of Honshu, I recalled my walks with Tomika, the fishermen at their nets, bare toes in the sand and the sense of its fading warmth, the sound of their voices and occasional laughter. The laughter of fishermen and their wives was not that of the bars or the crowded streets. It was a part of nature itself, mingling with the sigh and rush of the waves and the cries of seabirds. Had the war changed all this, erased it forever? Suddenly I wanted desperately to turn toward Onomichi. I would land on some empty stretch of shore, taking comfort in my very aloneness. The fish shacks would be vacant now, even the nets gone. But I would pause and listen. Listen for the last faint strains of haunting laughter. My earphones crackled, snapping me back to reality. "Enemy! 2 o'clock low. I peered anxiously, saw nothing, then shot a glance at our leader. He nodded, pointing downward at an angle with his finger, and my eyes followed. This time I saw them, formation after formation, a tremendous swarm of Grumman Hellcats, and they were headed directly for Hiro. For a moment I lost my breath. No, this could not be happening. It was an optical illusion, a fantasy. I checked my oxygen mask nervously, and all was in order. But the enemy was still there, still afar off, though increasingly substantial, an immense swarm, too numerous to count. Of course, I told myself, we wouldn't attack, not with only 5 aircraft. No, that would be sheer lunacy, and fortunately they were apparently unaware of us. It would be better, regardless, to perfect our flying skills. Air fights? Later, when we were more experienced. I glanced back off my right wing at Shiro Hashimoto, a recently acquired comrade, caught his eye and pointed toward the enemy below. Then I opened and closed my hand rapidly. Hashimoto nodded, actually grinned. And now, to my surprise, Shimada was turning, angling toward them. Automatically, the rest of us responded, following close behind. He was definitely tracking the Hellcats. Could this be possible? Attack? No, I told myself. We were merely observing to determine their intentions. Nevertheless, I checked my guns. It was always good to check, because one of these days, when the odds were better, we'd be using them. My ears buzzed, and I flinched. Incredible! We were going to attack. What should I do? Already I was forgetting everything I had learned. My mind had gone blank. I was on the verge of panic. Release auxiliary gas tank. Yes, that came first. Otherwise a single bullet could blow me into the next world. Tanks from our 4 other planes were already tumbling downward, and we were closing fast. Again I adjusted my mask. Again I checked my guns. What now? Just follow Shimada. No other choice. Yes, just follow Shimada. Do everything he does, and it will be all right. Remember how you followed the Mantis? Follow Shimada, only not so close, not so close. Don't tense up, don't freeze. Relax, Kuwahara, relax. Your back is like a gatepost. All right, better now. Breathe calmly. You can't fight the enemy if you're fighting yourself. Shimada's beginning his dive, so follow. Over you go, Kuwahara, over you go. Shimada has peeled off, seeming to lift slightly, balancing it seems for a full second on his wingtip, then dropping away with increasing speed, his nose angling toward the enemy. I am following his swiftly vanishing tail, and the Hellcats are in full view, growing larger at every second. At first, just minutes earlier, only toy planes, but now they are actual aircraft, formidable-looking fighters with men inside. Americans. It is absolutely clear now. We will strike at their rear, then fan off rapidly, hit and run. Too many for anything else. The enemy is still unaware of us. Should I begin firing? No. Wait for our leader. Do everything he does. But why doesn't he shoot? We can shoot now, spray them en masse and drop a dozen or more. Yes, yes, I'm sure we can. Nearer, nearer. Rapidly closing. Shimada is opening up, ripping off short, deadly bursts, swift red trails from the tracers, fleeting away with diabolical speed, seeming to arch and curve, heading for the enemy. The Hellcats are aware of us now, rolling off, no doubt in their minds. Fire, Kuwahara. Fire. I haven't even squeezed the trigger. Wildly I blaze away. Compulsive, attenuated blasts, all consumed by the sky. Then a Hellcat flips crazily, rotating belly up, veering off, angling downward. A remarkable maneuver, but no, he's hit. I hit him. Got him. No, no. Shimada has done it. My own tracers are swallowed again and again into an endless void of deepening blue. We flash on past the stricken aircraft, banking and climbing, eager for altitude. The entire tail of the Hellcat formation has scattered, the rest far ahead. 1/2 mile or so below, Shimada's victim is spiralling downward in its death throes, vomiting black smoke, smoke as black as tar. Flames lapping savagely with a kind of awful glee all along the fuselage. Fascinated, I watched its waning death plunge, gripped simultaneously by exultation and frustration. I had never known it would be so gratifying to see an enemy destroyed. But why couldn't I have been the one to do it? Just that one Hellcat when the chance was so perfect. But perfect opportunities, I soon discovered, are rare and very brief, usually only seconds, even for the most skilled. At the time, though, I didn't even remember having him in my sights. I had just fired away compulsively, hoping to score a hit by spraying enough sky. By now we were fleeing for home, and I caught a gleam of silver from the corner of my eye, above and off my right wing tip about 400 yards away. Then another and another, flashing and vanishing, among the wisps of cloud. Once I glanced down and caught my breath. A short distance below and to my right, 3 Hellcats were keeping pace. I had always supposed that the Hayabusa 2 could outdistance most other aircraft, including the enemy's, but the American fighters were keeping up, and we were going all out, full throttle. Maybe, I thought, they have better fuel, higher octane. No time then for further reflection. 3 more Hellcats, apparently the glints of silver I spotted seconds earlier, had materialized, diving at us head-on from 1,000 yards above, descending with terrifying speed. Strange ripping sounds within the top of my cockpit, but I failed to comprehend the cause. Holes appearing strangely along the trailing edge of my right wing. Instinctively I glanced to the rear and glimpsed a single enemy plane, closing at 300 yards, sporadic red lines, tracing the space that separated us and fleeting past my cockpit. "Cut right! Cut right!" The voice of Shimada just ahead, as he performed a tight rolling bank. The rest of us followed, and shortly thereafter I was on the tail of an enemy. Another chance, and this time I wouldn't betray it. I had him in my rangefinder now and fired off a calculated burst. A bit too high. 2 more, lengthier but more precise. The bullets were going home. It all had a dreamlike quality. The roaring of my motor, the fierce staccato thumping of my guns, the whitening sky. But the Grumman was wounded, trailing wisps of smoke. Ramming my plane into a steep climb, I glanced down, following its path, saw the pilot bail out. The chute trailed him, and for an instant I thought it had malfunctioned. Then it popped open, bringing with it recollections of the Mantis that day over the mountains of Fukugawa. Suddenly, I realized that I was no longer with our leader. There was nothing left of our formation, nothing but Americans and a few badly outnumbered Japanese scrambled throughout the clouds. Then, without the slightest warning, I heard the voice of Lieutenant Shimada. "I'm wounded. Burning. Going to crash. Save yourselves. Return and report." Simultaneously, I spotted his plane. It curved across my line of vision just ahead, caught in flame, a virtual fireball. Then a wild explosion as he struck the American Hellcat broadside, and the 2 planes were plummeting downward in flame and smoke, disintegrating. Now my own craft was vibrating strangely, coughing and trembling, the prop roar becoming hoarse and gravelly. My head felt light. I was not getting enough oxygen. Tearing off my mask, I dived steeply, saw the ocean's approach, and glanced at my airspeed indicator. It didn't register, and the wind was screeching through my new bullet holes. I stared at the fuel gauge, and my fears were confirmed. Little left. I'd never make it to Hiro. For now, however, there was no sign of the enemy. It was as if the destruction had spawned a wind to sweep the heavens clean. Gradually, nervously alert, I gained my bearings and limped onward toward Kyushu. The enemy's 50 caliber machine guns had created more havoc than I'd realized earlier. Even my compass was gone, but it was impossible to miss Kyushu, one of our 4 main islands there below the southwestern tip of Honshu. 20 minutes or so later, my motor still sputtering at times, gas tank nearly empty, I was nearing the airbase at Oita. Still no sign of my companions, and it was impossible to believe that Shimada was gone. I had observed his fiery death close hand, perhaps the only living witness, yet I could not make it register. My mind was numb. Now the landing strip was in sight, rapidly growing, and I circled, calling in for authorization to land. Moments later, as I made my approach, a warning sounded from below. "This is the control tower. Do not land. Your landing gear is not down." My pulse rate surged. "Repeat, do not land. Your landing gear is not down." Pulling back on the stick, I began my ascent, circling. I pushed the button again and again. "Your landing gear is not down." Frantically, I searched my instrument panel, knowing that only minutes remained, if that long, until my fuel was gone. Then, groping about beneath the panel, I discovered that the landing gear connecting wires had become separated, perhaps severed by a bullet. Fortunately, it was a simple matter to rejoin the ends, and this time as I pushed the button, my wheels lowered into position. Within a few seconds, I was again making my approach, landing with a slight jolt and screech of rubber, taxiing slowly toward the main hangar. My first air battle was over. Chapter 16. Honor and a Lost Cause. Upon returning to Hiro, I learned that 2 others of our group had made it to safety. My friend Shiro Hashimoto had been shot down but had survived with a badly shattered leg. A few days later, Oka, Yamamoto, Nakamura and I visited him at a hospital in Hiroshima and were depressed at what we found. Hashimoto's leg had been amputated and he had attempted suicide. Antiseptic odours assailed my nostrils as we entered the room, and I began to wish we had never come. What could we possibly do, even say that would help? Simultaneously, I was strangely fascinated by the scene. Hashimoto seemed to be a different person, wraith-like there in his white bed. His skin was ashen. Only the burning eyes revealed what was happening inside. The cotton blanket dropped away starkly where his leg should have been. Our greetings were uncertain, trite, somewhat embarrassed. "We brought you some magazines," I said, humiliated at the triviality of such a gesture. "Thanks, Kuwahara," he said, "but I don't feel like reading anything right now." "Well," I replied hesitantly, "maybe we can just leave them for you, until you're feeling better. I mean," I persisted, "I'm sure you'll be improving in a few days." Hashimoto shook his head, gasping a dry laugh. "How do you improve when a leg's been blasted off? Grow a new one?" I made no reply, and we all simply stood there, wordless and stupid. Yet something had to be said. Why were they leaving it all to me? I was becoming irritated and eventually blundered onward. "We know it's very hard for you right now," I said, and patted his hand, groping for an intelligent thought. "But you have fulfilled your obligation to the Emperor. You are a true samurai, far more than the rest of us, and from now on you will be able to do as you please, even find a wife and get married." I knew that last was a mistake even before I said it, but the words had simply tumbled out. "Oh yes," Hashimoto rasped. "Wonderful! Maybe I can find a good strong one like an ox who can carry a cripple on her back." Still, I kept talking. "I know how you feel, but lots of people are being wounded in this great war, and that doesn't mean they can't marry. Think of Lieutenant Shimada. He'll never—" "Would to God that I had followed Shimada," Hashimoto croaked, actually struggling to sit up as if he might attack me. Then he fell back with a moan, closing his eyes, barely breathing, it seemed. "What good am I?" he sighed. I could scarcely hear him. "To anybody." Silently cursing myself, I glanced at the others. There was no accusation in their own countenances, merely vacuity. Yamamoto shook his head and stared at the floor. Then Oka, with a slight toss of his head, indicated the door. Reluctantly, I started to leave, but turned back for an instant, patting his shoulder. "We'll see you again soon," I said, knowing that we might never see him at all. It was too painful. Just then footsteps sounded in the hallway. A man and a woman entered, obviously Hashimoto's parents. After we had exchanged introductions, the woman turned to her son without speaking and laid her hand upon his brow. Long, delicate fingers, slightly tremulous. "Here," Oka volunteered and slid the room's only chair her way. Thanking him, she sat down and continued to stroke Hashimoto's forehead. Again there was silence, and again we were ready to leave, but now the woman was speaking. Why must people fight? Why must they hate and destroy each other? Why? Her voice was surprisingly rich and low, filled with incredulity. She was shaking her head now, eyes half closed. Oh, the senselessness of it all! The stupidity! Why can't— She hesitated, eyes closed for an instant, collecting herself. Shiro's father and I did not rear him so that he could lose his leg, nor did we rear his brother Joji to die in some awful jungle on Guadalcanal. Hesitantly, I informed her that I had recommended her son for the Medal of Valor, but that too was a mistake. Obviously, the only way to avoid further idiocy was to keep my mouth shut. For a moment I gazed out the window across Hiroshima. Little did I comprehend how ironic her comments about death and destruction would become in the days ahead, and how applicable with respect to that city. At the moment, I devoutly wished that we had never come there, that I could simply vanish. "I did not mean to hurt your feelings," she said, "or to appear ungrateful, but there is something I must tell you all before you go. Look at me, all of you," she commanded, and we glanced at her in surprise. "Listen to me carefully, my sons." Our astonishment increased. Her voice was harsh and dry, almost guttural, yet somehow very appealing, and her eyes possessed a kind of passionate fluidity. "Your minds are filled with strange ideas," she continued, "much that is false and malevolent. Ideas about honour and glory, dying with valour, these and many related matters." Her face was solemn, remarkably commanding, etched with many lines, but also beautiful. Her hair contained a startling streak of white, as though it might have been splashed with acid. "But I advise you to forget such things. Seek only to preserve life, your own and those of others. Life alone is sacred." Her eyes held us hypnotically. "There is no honour, my sons, in dying for a lost cause." I stared at her in disbelief, shot a glance at her husband, expecting him to rebuke her. As though reading my thoughts, she eyed him sharply, but he remained silent. "Fathers feel no differently about this than mothers do," she persisted, "not deep inside." Suddenly I recalled with great poignancy how my own father had looked into my eyes months earlier and inquired, "Do you know my heart?" Shortly afterward we said goodbye, but all the way back to Hiro I kept hearing the words of Hashimoto's mother. There is no honour in dying for a lost cause. A lost cause? An indescribable feeling was settling, infusing the very pores of my skin with hopelessness. Throughout the following days those words persisted. The feeling increased, and gradually I became indignant. Who was that woman that she could presume to speak such heresy? A mere woman! And her husband! He must have been a small man. Indeed, a very small man. Obviously she was in command of that household. She controlled him, heresy in and of itself. But my indignation often left me as rapidly as it had come. Always the cold and frightened feeling returned, increasing. I had not seen much of Tatsuno the past few weeks. Both of us, of course, were heavily involved in our military duties, but gradually I came to realize that he made me uncomfortable in much the same way Hashimoto's mother had. What had he said during our last actual visit? Something about the secret. Yes, what was the secret? What were we waiting for? I had no answer, none at least that I could accept emotionally. Surely the words of Hashimoto's mother and Tatsuno did not reflect the attitude of our people in general. And yet, I could not deny it. The disillusionment was growing, and at last I began to face the facts. Japan had been driven back 3,000 miles across the Pacific. MacArthur had returned to the Philippines, entering Luzon and vanquishing our forces at Leyte Gulf. This I had learned through the winds of military rumour, but the winds had now attained gale force. Although I did not realize it initially, that loss had virtually eliminated Japan as a naval power. Even then, however, I knew that it had exerted a serious impact on troop morale. For many months the Americans had taken very few captives, but now we were surrendering in substantial numbers. Of course, there was Kamikaze. The suicide attacks had increased on a grand scale, and from all that we could learn they had been highly effective. For a time, in fact, they had fanned the flames of hope, yet still. Would Kamikaze actually stop the enemy? If so, it would require far more human bombs. Colonel Okamura's estimate that 300 suicide planes could alter the war in our favour was obviously much too small. Nevertheless, a part of me clung to the fraying branches of hope. If a divine wind had saved our country once when her plight was just as desperate, why not again? Was not the imperial way the right way after all? The best way, ultimately, for the world? Was not Japan divinely destined for leadership? If indeed there were a God, one of truth, reason, and justice, was it not only right, but also eminently logical that he should come to our rescue? Possibly our present trials were the final test, one of our courage and worthiness. So maybe, just when our plight looked the most bleak as night was closing in, our circumstances would improve. But how many human bombs would it require? Many of our men were still willing to lay down their lives. To many, in fact, it was no sacrifice. To some, honour and duty were, in very deed, heavier than the mountains, death lighter than a feather. In any event, the divine wind was steadily mounting, and as it increased, more and more of us would be drawn into it. Only a matter of time, only a matter of time. The clouds were darkening above Hiro. The first gusts were coming. Chapter 17. Death Greets the New Year. On New Year's Day 1945, fighter pilots from Hiro's 4th Squadron held a testimonial ceremony for those of our number who had died. Captain Yoshiro Tsubaki, the squadron commander, delivered an impassioned speech declaring our moral obligation to avenge those deaths. And later we visited Hiro's military shrine. Not many had died yet from Hiro. In fact, all my close friends were still with me. There was one name, however, that I will never forget, that of Lieutenant Jiro Shimada, who had died and taken an enemy with him in my first air battle. For a long time I gazed at his nameplate there on the base of the shrine, one of the fallen valiant. Again I saw his plane like a flaming meteor, the crashing and billowing explosion. The two aircraft, fused as one, then decimated, the blackened, smoking fragments dropping toward the water. Japanese and American, united even in the midst of their disintegration. Falling, falling, falling down and away. No more New Year's for you, Lieutenant Shimada. The words were not spoken, mere pulsations in my mind. You have fulfilled your obligation to the Emperor. Then, very slowly, I turned and walked away. What sad attempts we made, our words of Happy New Year falling like frozen clods to the earth. No doubt all of us were thinking of New Year's Day at home somewhere in the dreamscape of the past. I recalled with a sudden twinge of nostalgia how Tamika and I had run through our home on that same day years before, jubilantly scattering beans about to drive out the evil spirits. The spirit that entered Hiro that New Year's afternoon in 1945, however, could not be driven out by scattering beans, even by the shedding of blood. It was then that Captain Tsubaki called a meeting unlike anything I had experienced before or since. It was then that Hiro's first kamikaze were appointed. Those of you unwilling to lay down your lives as divine sons of the great Nippon Empire will not be required to do so. Such had been his words, his promise. Then, the ultimate dramatic pause, his eyes like burning cinders. Those incapable of accepting this honor will raise their hands now. Ah yes, to be a suicide pilot, a kamikaze. That would be the honor of honors. Had not everyone said so? But 6 men had raised their hands during that meeting in response to the captain's promise of exemption, men I knew well. Afraid enough, or perhaps brave enough, to admit what most of us secretly felt. They had chosen life and been given death, a dubious honor. A few months earlier, men at other bases had volunteered with apparent alacrity. Now, it would seem, many had to be compelled, even tricked. Stern evidence that kamikaze was already considered a failure, a futile death by ever-growing numbers. Daily the Allies were becoming stronger. There was no denying it now. Moving ever closer, with more men, more ships, more aircraft. The B29 superfortresses, ominous grumbling monstrosities that they were, had begun to clot the heavens, leaving swaths of fire and destruction. The American naval forces were closing in a terrible juggernaut. How I hated to admit it, fought against the very idea, but it would not be denied. Japan was losing fast. How long, I wondered, would our people be able to hide behind a crumbling facade of propaganda? How much longer could anyone remain in denial? 6 at Hiro had refused to, and now, ironically, would forfeit their lives in consequence. Early in January, only days after our meeting, they left Hiro for suicide training. Periodically from then on, men were selected from my squadron and transferred to Kyushu for their final preparations, never to be heard of again. For nearly a year now, we had been carefully conditioned to accept the inevitability and glory of death in battle. For thousands, actually, it was a part of our historic philosophy. But now, suddenly, the tentacles were reaching out, relentlessly taking and taking. With each departure, our sense of doom expanded. Sometimes it was a leaden feeling in the gut, sometimes a clotting in the throat. Increasingly it was both, often accompanied by waves of sadness, nascent tears, and a kind of crying of the heart. On the other hand, I had come through several air battles now with a second enemy plane to my credit, and that had at least increased my confidence as a fighter pilot. Flying over the inlet between Kure and Tokuyama, 6 of us had jumped 2 American fighters, and it had been surprisingly easy. Approximately 1,000 feet above them, we veered off, diving at terrific speed and struck from the rear, almost before they were aware of our existence. All 6 of us opening up simultaneously with cannons and machine guns. The nearest American virtually disintegrated under our combined onslaught and went down in a sheet of flame. The second attempted to escape, performing a sharp bank to throw us off, but 2 of us had anticipated the move, and within seconds I had him in my rangefinder. It was almost that simple. 3 or 4 fierce bursts, and he folded, plummeting downward in a smoking tailspin. How different from my first encounter with the enemy. I almost felt cheated. So I was becoming a capable pilot rather quickly, as also was Nakamura, with 1 plane to his own credit. Yet no matter how skilled we might be, no matter how many adversaries we might vanquish, the supply seemed unlimited. Indeed, relentlessly, growing almost fiendishly. Doom was omnipresent like an oncoming tidal wave. Only one hope for survival now, a tenuous wisp which I scarcely dared contemplate. The merest acknowledgement, in fact, spelled disloyalty, if not cowardice. It was February 1945, and the enemy was attacking Iwo Jima, just over 650 miles from our capital, so perhaps the war would end before long. Most of us, I suspect, prayed for this. Not directly, perhaps, for the defeat of our country, but rather for a cessation to hostilities. Truly a strange and paradoxical form of denial. Many of our civilians still had faith that Japan would prevail, but we who lived within the inferno had to be either naive, fanatical, or both to expect triumph now. Within only a few weeks, my conviction regarding Japan's impending fate had become a kind of groundswell, and gradually my fears of compromising myself began to evaporate. Now that surrender was only a matter of time, irrevocable, I was praying for it with increasing fervour and frequency. It had become the classic race against the calendar, perhaps even the clock, and ironically, only the enemy could save us. Some of us at least had greater hope than others. Most of our flyers at Hiro were inexperienced, and already I was among those ranked as top pilots. Such men would be preserved as long as possible to provide base protection and fighter escort for suicide missions into the Pacific. We would return and report in detail upon their success. Consequently, our poorest pilots died first, causing the enemy to conclude, initially at least, that there were no skillful kamikaze. In the words of American Admiral Mark Mitcher, "One thing is certain, there are no experienced kamikaze pilots." Regularly at this point, orders from the Daihone in Tokyo were sent to key air installations throughout the 4 main islands, specifying how many pilots each base would contribute at any given time. These larger installations, in turn, drew men from bases within their jurisdiction. The one at Hiroshima, for example, drew from nearby Hiro, our own base, also from Kure and Yokoshima, all on the main island of Honshu. Men were then committed to special suicide bases, including Kagoshima, the largest, on the southern inlet of Kyushu. In general, kamikaze attacks were mounted in waves of 15 or 20 planes at 30-minute intervals. Some of those pilots were allegedly sealed or locked into their cockpits, but I never witnessed such things, nor, in my opinion, was there any reason for it. Once it all began, there was no turning back except for a rare few who returned, having been unable to find the enemy. Frequently, in fact, our kamikaze actually opened their cockpits and signalled with flags or scarves upon sighting the first American ships, a final show of bravado, a last gesture to boost one's courage before the plunge into oblivion. No one living will ever comprehend the feelings of those men who covenanted with death. Not even condemned murders, not fully. The murderer is atoning for the ultimate crime against God and humanity. Justice is meted out. Of course, men throughout the world have died for their countries, sometimes knowing in advance that death was inevitable. But where, before or since, has there ever been such massive and premeditated self-destruction as occurred with the kamikaze? Where have thousands of men diligently set about their own annihilation, training methodically, relentlessly, mulling over all the details for weeks, sometimes months? Neither the Shintoistic concept of a post-mortal existence as a guardian warrior in the spirit realms, nor the Buddhistic doctrine of nirvana has always provided solace. The mad, fanatic Jap was often a mere schoolboy, snared in the great skein of fate, not above weeping for the arms of his mother in many cases. Not that there weren't fanatical Japanese fighters. Some wanted nothing but to die gloriously, to honour the emperor, to gain revenge. Even the subdued, bespectacled student, browsing through some Tokyo library, might be moulded by circumstances into a flaming soul dedicated to death. And there were some who seemed to approach the end as though it were only a morning stroll. In general, however, we pilots moved along 2 broad paths. The Kichigai, madmen, were fierce in their hatred, seeking honour and immortality, living for only one purpose, to die. Many of these came from the Navy Air Force, which contributed a far greater number of kamikaze. As time passed, I personally allied myself more closely with a second group whose sentiments were basically the opposite, though rarely expressed openly. These men, mainly the better educated, were referred to as Sukebe, libertines, by the Kichigai. I should stress, however, that the Sukebe were not unpatriotic, not at least in their own view. I would die for my country today if necessary, as I would have died then. But life was decidedly dearer to us. We saw no purpose in death for death's sake alone, and at times now our country's fate welled ominously like the seething crater of a volcano as viewed through endlessly shifting vapours. Certainly also there was a middle ground, and each man's attitude fluctuated to some extent from hour to hour. There were times when I longed for revenge, or when I considered that by destroying an American ship I might save many of my people. Then my own life seemed insignificant. How often I had struggled for a certain attitude toward death, a special, indescribable feeling of acceptance. What was it that made men unafraid? Was it courage? What was courage? "We are expendable," that was the cry. "Be resolved that honour is heavier than the mountains, and death lighter than a feather." Countless times I had repeated those words, repeated them obsessively. With some men that conviction seems to have been innate. With me it was ephemeral. I was always fighting to rekindle the flame. All of my friends were still with me. Tatsuno, now a fighter pilot. To be a fighter pilot, to be with my friends against the enemy. That had always been my dream, but it was a tattered and fading dream already. Some of us were bound to make our final one-way trip soon, no matter how good we were. Who would be first? Daily I went through our routine suicide practice. Methodically I performed each dive, with absolute precision now, near perfection, but little satisfaction. Mechanically I performed the exercise, beginning with a leaden feeling in the stomach that swelled throughout my throat, expanding into dread. More than once the words came, go on, don't stop, crash. It will all be over in an instant. No more fear, no more waiting, no more sorrow." And always I would pull out, calling myself a coward. In addition, there were the occasional air battles, most of them only quick scraps or sorties, in which we struck swiftly and fled. Invariably, the enemy outnumbered us, and our lives were now dedicated to something more vital than a mere air skirmish. Japan was like a man dying in the desert with little water left. The remaining drops had to be used sparingly, saved for the hours when the sun would burn its fiercest. As the months faded, Japan began to reel, losing her grip on eastern China. The heart of Tokyo had been demolished, and our entire homeland was being ravaged. Millions of tons of our merchant shipping had been sunk, and by the Emperor's birthday in April of 1945, the enemy was assaulting Okinawa, Japan's very doorway. It was a crucial time. Premier Suzuki had told the Japanese cabinet, "Our hopes to win the war are anchored solely in the fighting on Okinawa. The fate of the nation and its people depends on the outcome." Okinawa fell. 81 days of violent battle. The months squirmed by, and one day in May it happened. Okai and Yamamoto. I had returned from a flight over Shikoku and heard the news. I hadn't seen either of them for 2 or 3 days because we had been flying different shifts on reconnaissance. And now it had come, what I had been fearing all along but never fully accepted. The orders had been issued suddenly, and my friends had been transferred within the hour to Kagoshima. Okai and Yamamoto gone. I could not believe it and rushed to their barracks. Surely they could not have been swept away so quickly. The door creaked as I entered, and I gazed down the long line of cots. The bedding was gone from 2 of them, the thin, worn mattresses rolled, leaving only the barren springs. There was something ghastly about those beds. The naked springs cried out. I opened their empty lockers and heard their hollow clang, a death knell. Dazed, I slumped down on one of the empty cots, feeling it sag. It was as if Oka and Yamamoto had been carried off by a sudden gale. How could such a thing have happened? No time, no notice, but of course it was probably best that way. I sat there alone, and for a while there was nothing but silence, not even the sound of motors. For several minutes I stared at the floor, on through it. Saw nothing, felt nothing. It was too much to comprehend. The place was a void. No telling how long I sat there, insensible. Eventually I actually dozed for a moment, then startled awake as a hand rested on my shoulder. Nakamura. I hadn't even heard him enter. Without speaking, we looked at each other. Someone was with him. Tatsuno. I extended my own hand uncertainly, and he gripped it. "You know," I managed at last, my throat parched. I had the strangest feeling sitting here. It was as if... My voice cracked. It was just as if everybody had left. This whole base empty. Nobody. Nobody anywhere. It was crazy. Have you ever had that kind of feeling? They said to tell you sayonara, Yasbei, Nakamura said. My friends were often calling me after the samurai now. Still joking, even when they got into the truck. Nakamura gave a strange laugh. You know what Oka said? His last words? He said, "You and Yasbei take good care of all our girls in Hiro." I also laughed, if only because of the release it provided. Neither of us, or Tatsuno for that matter, ever went to Hiro or the nearby cities. We rarely drank and knew little of the city women with whom our extrovertish friends had consorted. For an instant I recalled my times with our two departed, remembering how we became well acquainted that winter night so long ago when I'd found the warm shower. They had been joking then and never stopped. Even in combat they joked, two of a kind, always together. Ironically, they would die together, perhaps already had. But why did they go so soon? Good pilots, both of them, I asked. Yes, pretty good, Nakamura replied. But lone wolves, maybe a little erratic. The days of the lone wolves are gone. I know Nakamura, I said, but look at some of the other pilots in this squadron. Not half as good, not half as good. Maybe they're putting the names in a hat now, Tatsuno suggested. That way it's more entertaining. That way you don't know whether it will come in 5 minutes or 5 months. Let's get out of here, I said. Take a walk, anything. Part 5. Chapter 18. Wind Among the Lanterns. At times, even now, the terror of Kamikaze fluctuated, even seemed to fade. After all, we reminded ourselves, there were many ways one could die. The bombs were coming often now, and we were learning what it was like to scramble like rats for our holes. Sometimes the enemy would sneak through our radar screens, and the alarms would scream, providing little or no warning. Now we knew what it was to feel the ground shudder with explosions, to cower in dust-choked craters, while the slower men were often blown apart. Once I had seen 2 labourers running frantically, the bombs dropping directly on top of them. I closed my eyes, then opened them. Nothing remained but new craters. Regularly now our hangars and assembly plant were being strafed and dive-bombed by Hellcats, P-51 Mustangs and light bombers. Then one fatal day in June, an immense flight of B29’s pulverized Hiro and nearby Kure Navy port. The warning had sounded 30 minutes beforehand, and because of their numbers, every available pilot had taken off to preserve our remaining aircraft. But after that bombing, there was virtually nothing left of Hiro, no base to which we could return. Consequently, we had to make the long and sorrowful flight to Oita Air Base in northeastern Kyushu. It was there that I became a suicide escort. Today, very few of us remain, the only ones who can testify to what happened out there with the American ships in the Pacific, who can describe how the doomed pilots acted and probably felt at the final moment. Life at this base became increasingly grim, yet even so it was fascinating to note individual reactions. The punishment of earlier days was over. Tested and proved, we were among the elite of Nippon's fighting airmen. As such, we were given extra money and told to enjoy ourselves during off hours. Men who had rarely touched liquor took to heavy drinking, and many who had never even kissed a woman joined the lines at the prostitute's door. 10 minutes a turn. Women and drink had long been considered vices as far as fighter pilots were concerned, not exactly immoral as some other cultures might view it, but wrong because pilots had a duty to perform, a monumental obligation which nothing should hinder. The imperial rescript itself contained stern warnings about succumbing to creature comforts and self-indulgence. In our own case, however, greater license was granted. We were the men with numbered days, and everywhere the sense of finality was growing. People who would have condemned others for such actions now said nothing. Life was short, and the airmen, especially fighter pilots, were highly esteemed, almost idolized by most of the public. To some, religion and the pure life became all the more meaningful, and several of us hiked into the nearby mountains to feel the caress of nature, to escape, to meditate, Occasionally, Nakamura, Tatsuno, and I went together as comrades, trying to cast aside the grimmer aspects of life as completely as possible. On one occasion, we sat together and reflected upon life rather profoundly for people our age. Tatsuno was the real philosopher, though, always probing deeper into the mysteries of existence than most people do. Despite all he had seen of death and sorrow, Tatsuno believed that life had a purpose, that it was the ultimate school of schools, that even the most terrible physical pain or mental anguish had a place in the eternal scheme. Once the three of us sat on a knoll, gazing across the ocean to where the clouds were creating a resplendent sunset of orange, gold, amber, and blazing red like the heart of a blast furnace. Between the clouds stretched the horizon in a narrow, irregular expanse of pale green. Above it all, the sky was a royal blue, deepening into purple, and a single star pulsed the colour of Mercury. "Some day?" Tatsuno mused and paused. "Some day what?" Nakamura asked. Tatsuno waited for a minute or more. "Maybe it will all fall into place." He shrugged, twisted his head. "Pain and sorrow. Maybe none of that will really matter except in terms of how we met it. Some people come away stronger, better, or death. Some see it, and they are destroyed. Others seem to gain a greater appreciation for all of life, a greater reverence. It's as if the spirit itself has been polished and refined. Maybe that sounds crazy, but I think that's the idea." Nakamura was frowning. "Yes, but whose idea?" "Somebody's," Tatsuno replied at last. "Maybe just mine. Maybe whoever's in charge." On other occasions, my walks were solitary. Alone one Sunday morning, I wandered past small, well-tended farms toward the mountains. On either side of me stretched the rice fields, dotted at intervals with farmers, some with yokes over their shoulders carrying buckets of human waste, others irrigating or at work with hoes. Those farmers were artisans, their crops laid out with patience and devotion, with drawing-board precision. Old women were also scattered throughout some of the fields, pulling weeds. For hours they would bend in the traditional squatting position, nothing visible but their backs and umbrella-like straw hats. These aged brown obasan of the earth lived to toil. For them work was more than mere expediency. It was life itself. All had known hardship. Many had lost sons in the war. Many had been forced to sell their daughters. But always those weathered faces were ready to form cracked smiles of greeting and welcome. For them, life emanated from the rice where the sun warmed their backs and the mud oozed up between their toes. Another woman nearby sometimes to converse with, and easy laughter. That was life, and it was enough. Never before had I envied old women. Respected them truly, as I did our elderly in general, but never envied them until then. Walking slowly up the long dirt road, I passed an ox with a ring in his nose. He was tied to a tree, switching his tail occasionally at the flies. The ox seemed very calm and resigned. That was his life, there beneath the tree, and he accepted it. The hole in his nose had formed a scarred lining long ago. The ring did not hurt now. Remove it, and he might wander vaguely, I decided. Probably, though, he would remain where he was, flicking his tail. That was enough. So in the end, conditions didn't matter nearly so much as perspective. Acceptance, resignation, that was the important thing. Near the foot of the mountain, the lane fanned into a broad gravelled road, extending 100 yards to a stone stairway. The steps ascended in tiers, passing beneath several great wooden torii. Midway, a woman holding a bright yellow parasol was climbing upward with a baby in a carrying cloth upon her back. Even from that distance I knew that the baby would not be dangling limply. It would be hugging her back like some tiny arboreal creature. Bright, dark eyes, incredibly luminous, peering alertly over her shoulder, drinking in the world, the universe, reflecting them. Passing beneath the final upper torii, I emerged in a clearing where temples and shrines lay in a half-moon, their walls covered with intricately carved designs, their eaves curving upward at the tips. Part of one facade was carved with golden dragons, another with red and green lions possessing strangely human faces. Still another was adorned with flowers, exotic plant life, bending reeds, and low-flying waterfowl. At the entrance to the clearing, an aged man and a young girl, probably his granddaughter, were selling amulets. All alone, those two, just the old man and the little girl. There, where sunlight and trees filigreed the land with light and shadow, where a breeze played intermittently along the lattices and the ancient buildings. Having purchased one of the charms, I strolled ahead toward the buildings. At the entrance to the main temple were many lanterns, the centre one, red, black, and gold, about 6 feet in diameter. I was surprised that so few people were present, but reminded myself that this was a remote area. It was still early. Once I glimpsed the yellow parasol gliding among some trees before vanishing behind a pagoda. Climbing the temple steps very slowly, meditatively, I paused at the entrance and gazed into the darkened and hallowed confines. It required a few seconds for my eyes to adjust to the dimness, but gradually the faintly burnished wooden floors materialized, then the darkened corridors, all of it simmering with reverence and quiescence, faintly echoing the ages past. No bombs had fallen here, nor, I devoutly hoped, would they. Here the war did not exist, and everything within seemed expectant, gently beckoning. I removed my shoes and hesitated, caressed suddenly by the cooler temperature. Looming a short distance before me was an immense rounded statue of Buddha, towering perhaps 15 feet into the gloom. It was a pale grey-green, like oxidized copper, yet it seemed to emanate a steady, subtly expanding glow. Automatically I knelt, gazing upward into its face. What a countenance! How indescribably benign and imperturbable! How removed from the petty cares of the world! The longer I gazed, the lighter it became, and the more it seemed to convey— what? Almost a smugness at having so fully transcended the mundane. But no, not smugness, I decided, for it had transcended that too. All such concerns, all triviality, all vanity. It was, instead, the very quintessence of tranquillity. For perhaps an hour I sat there, my legs tucked beneath me, meditating. I did not comprehend all the differences between the religion of Buddha and national Shintoism. Nor did I understand how it was possible for a person to embrace both simultaneously as many in my country actually did, for their doctrines regarding an afterlife seemed utterly antithetic. On the one hand lay ultimate transcendency, ultimate liquidation of individual identity and absorption into the grand and universal soul, much as a drop of water enters the ocean. On the other, the perpetuation of personality and of human relationships. For our fighting men, those who died valiantly in battle, the honour of being guardian warriors in the realms beyond. As present, however, differences in theology were irrelevant. For the moment I was already in another world. If death is anything like this, I thought, then perhaps it won't matter much how it comes, as Tatsuno says, only in terms of how we face it. A few years one way or another in reality, for all of us. Then it will come as surely as the setting of the sun, as surely as cherry blossoms fall by the roadside. And after that? What it was, I did not know, yet there had to be something, an outcome that was correct and in keeping with the grand and proper order of things. Something about that temple impelled me to linger on and on. There, in that remote sanctuary, I was safe, and the world beyond the mountain was unreal. For a time I actually believed that I had found the solution. I would stay here forever beyond all harm, all strife, all sorrow. Ere long I would become a priest. Yes, that was my answer. Here where antiquity hovered, absorbing the present and the future. Here in this eternal fourth dimension, this place of sweet sadness and attenuated nostalgia, of kindness, of ultimate reconciliation. How long I remained there, I am uncertain, but the sun had crossed its zenith, and the shadows of afternoon were expanding. At length I arose and left, turning my back upon the great Buddha, feeling the persistence of its vibrations, and entered the waiting day. Sitting upon the stairs a short distance below was a man in a white robe, his head shaven bald and faintly gleaming. His hands rested in his lap, and as I drew closer it appeared that he was totally relaxed, remarkably in tune with his surroundings, much like the Buddha itself. His gaze was directed at the distant sky and ocean. As I passed by, his voice came warmly, with remarkable resonance. "Good afternoon, young airman." "Good afternoon," I replied uncertainly. "You have come from Oita?" "Yes, revered sir, from Oita." I hesitated, angling a furtive glance, fearful that either refusal to look his way at all or a direct stare would be disrespectful. Simultaneously, it occurred to me that his hair was actually very dense, the dark roots sheening through his scalp like an abundance of iron filings. "Do you have a few moments?" he continued, "or must you now return to your base immediately?" I hesitated, unaccountably embarrassed. "I must—" I began, then reversed myself. "I have a few minutes, revered sir." "Good," he said, giving a quick nod. "Come and sit down. We shall enjoy the trees and beautiful vistas together." Bowing, I introduced myself and sat beside him as directed. Strangely enough, the uneasiness swiftly receded. After all, I reminded myself, the season is late. Why waste it on timidity? It was good now simply to be in this man's presence, to converse or remain silent. Soon, however, he began to ask me questions: where my home was, how long I had been a pilot, how long at Oita, and at last, "What is your present assignment?" "Fighter pilot," I said. "In a few days I will be flying escort missions." "Ah, so." The words came quietly, politely, the eyebrows barely elevating. "For the Kamikaze?" I nodded. "Yes, revered sir." For a time he offered no reply, merely nodded faintly, contemplating the horizon. Eventually he spoke, inquiring thoughtfully and at length regarding my background and family, and all the while I wondered when he was going to speak to me officially, with formality, as a Buddhist priest and as my elder. He never did. Clouds were collecting about the sun now, enhancing the shadows and the breeze. Its tendrils were playing over us, stirring trees in the valley below. "Wind is a strange phenomenon," he observed quietly. "Is it not?" For an instant I regarded his profile, one a bit like my father's. We don't really know its point of origin, nor can we see it. "That is true," I acknowledged. "Yet it is always present somewhere, always manifesting itself, always moving. No doubt it is one of those things that will always be." He paused. "Do you believe that the spirit of man itself might be somewhat similar?" "Perhaps so," I said. "You and I," he continued slowly. "I mean the essence, that something which makes you and me who we are. I suspect that it will always be, much like the wind, always somewhere, moving, doing its work, becoming manifest." "My friend Tatsuno feels that way," I told him. I greatly want to also." "Ah, so." Again the exclamation with the same subdued politeness, and he regarded me curiously, earnestly. "There is not one thing that ever reduces itself to mere absence," he said, "even the human body." He held out his own hands, strong-looking hands with pronounced, widely branching veins. His fingernails were impressively well groomed. "Destroyed, most certainly." The fingers closed, forming fists, "but not annihilated." I glanced at him. Those last words had come with a kind of passion. His face was fiercely resolute. Then his manner became more mild once more. "Changed, yes, in remarkable ways, but not obliterated. Matter, energy, they have always existed. They were not woven from an empty loom. They will always be. I nodded. Perhaps so, revered sir. And thus, my friend— his hand actually settled upon my shoulder for an instant. Although the spirit can depart this frail tabernacle called the body, that should not concern us unduly. It is all a part of the grand cosmic order, and we continue. The wind has left these lanterns now. It is far away, quiescent for the moment perhaps, but the air itself is everywhere. Soon it was time to go, and I departed, offering much thanks and several bows of respect. I hope that you will return, Airman Kuwahara, he said. I likewise, revered father, I replied. Then I left the clearing, descending the long stone stairway beneath the torii,